All right, hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Building an Effective Learning and Development Plan for the Cloud. My name is Hillary and I will be your MC for this webinar. Thank you so much for joining the conversation. Before we get started, let's cover some of the webinar functionalities. So during this webinar, everyone's microphone will be muted, but we want this to be an open conversation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box or the chat window at the bottom of your screen. There will also be a dedicated Q&A session after the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants by the end of the week. Joining us today as panelists, we have our very own Brian Carlson and Miles Brown. Brian Carlson is the Director of Sales at ExitCertified and has over 20 years of experience in the IT training industry, working with large and medium-sized clients to build enterprise-scale training programs. Miles Brown is our Senior Cloud and DevOps Advisor and has over 20 years of experience in the IT industry across a variety of platforms. Recognized as an AWS Authorized Instructor and a Google Cloud Platform Professional Architect, Miles has delivered award-winning authorized IT training for the biggest cloud providers. With this said, Miles and Brian, please take it away.
Thank you, Hillary. All right, Brian. Brian, you in a car?
Yeah, I thought that'd be kind of a funny way to start here. So we have a major outage AT&T has here in my area, and so I have zero internet. I don't have cell service. I don't even have text service at my house. So I went to the Starbucks, but it was a little too crowded to do this. So I'm sitting in my car right now doing the webinar. So if I suddenly disappear, one of a few things happen. So.
All right, well, I got your back. I think I can cover it if you can't make it. So I thought I'd pop up the agenda here. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenge for learning and development teams when it comes to, finding a good training partner in general, but in really specifically dealing with requests for cloud training, because it's a pretty nebulous term. It could mean a lot of different things. And so we'll look a little bit at the cloud training landscape and then try and talk about what's the best way to elicit those requests to find out exactly what people need when they say, we need cloud training, right? And then we'll just do a little sales pitch at the very end, talking about why ExitCertified would be a good partner. We will have some time for questions at the end. So if you have questions in the meantime, you can throw it in the chat. It's probably the easiest way. Both Brian and I will see it there. So I thought we'd start with the challenge for learning and development teams. And we have a few stats here. But just in general, Brian, what do you see as some of the big problems learning and development teams run into?
First off, so often it's around technology, and their technical terms, their technical concepts, they're constantly changing. And so many of the customers that we work with that are in L&D roles, or even project manager roles, or sometimes even like a director or VP, they do struggle to kind of understand the overall shift in technology, and especially kind of where they bring in the skills that are needed and identify those correct skills and all those things. So it is a lot to wrap your arms around, and that's why we exist, right? Is to help folks get through that. We're kind of like your consultant to help get through these kinds of things.
Yeah, and especially around cloud, because we do see it such a need. And here's some stats: 44% of business leaders already accelerated or plan to accelerate their digital transformation. I mean, every customer we talk to is either already moved partially to the cloud or is planning to. At this point, almost every size organization we deal with is doing something with the cloud. And there's some real business challenges around skilling, sourcing and managing that training, especially for those emerging open source technologies you mentioned. That's an area where, things have really changed, because say 10, 15 years ago, it was a very different landscape for training, right? And you and I both worked in the training business for a long time. And what we used to see is what, you would have sort of one vendor. You'd be an IBM shop or maybe an Oracle shop, right?
Or the trends then were, I remember when networking and Cisco was all the rage, and so customers were moving and very quickly and spending their money and hiring on folks to get their Cisco infrastructure up and running, right? Basic networking, and VoIP became really important, security, all those topics. And so every time you ran into this new technology, you started adding new products to your infrastructure. The vendor was right there with a learning path, and the classes all aligned, and it just worked really well and really easily. But that's changed.
Yeah, for sure. And these days, what I find is, when we're talking to customers, a lot of times they say, we need cloud training. And you're like, well, what does that mean? They may not know, right? So what do IT leaders mean when they tell learning and development, we need cloud training? Sometimes it's very easy, right? Like they come to you and they say, hey, we're moving to AWS, we need some AWS training, right? So your cloud vendor of choice. And there's some great, authorized content from each one of those cloud vendors. And ExitCertified, we've been partnered with all of these for a long time now. We started in the cloud probably 2014 is when we first started with AWS.
And I'll even jump in, Miles, and say, sometimes when IT leaders say they need cloud training, they're not entirely sure. If to be totally honest, they have a general idea, obviously, but they haven't had the time to dig down and get into all the different job roles and technologies that the organization's using, and sometimes they're not even aware of everything.
Yeah.
And so it certainly takes some investigation, regardless of whatever company you're in.
Yeah. Now, what I find is that each cloud vendor is sort of very good at teaching you about their infrastructure, right? But what you're running in, what kind of workloads you're running in those in that infrastructure, there's a lot of different things you could be doing. You could be taking your existing apps and just do a lift and shift, but more likely you're trying to embrace the cloud. And this is a term that you and I are both very familiar with, cloud native development. It's a big buzzword these days. And what it really means is, sort of adopting this kind of DevOps approach, maybe embracing the concept of microservices architectures and using things like containers and Kubernetes and automation, right? And so when they say we need cloud training, it might be a lot more than just, I need to take a couple of intro classes on AWS, right? I need to change how we develop software to really fully embrace the cloud and get all the advantages of it, right? And so that's sort of one approach, right?
And to give you an example there too, we're working with a large customer who they're moving over to Red Hat OpenShift. And it's easy for somebody higher up to say, oh, we have a big OpenShift initiative. But the reality is the first step in that whole project is not even OpenShift training. It's more around microservices, containers, Kubernetes, those kinds of concepts that their folks need to understand before they can effectively move over to OpenShift. And so although the company mandate is a tool like OpenShift or a platform like AWS, oftentimes there's fundamental conceptual training that's key before you really get into those product specific trainings. Yeah,
for sure. Another big thing we see in the cloud is the concept of serverless. And that usually it's another way to implement microservices. It's usually that you can get from the vendor specifically, right? But there's all kinds of areas that are dealing with cloud. A big thing that we find is once people start moving a lot of workloads to the cloud, now they're generating a lot of data in the cloud. And so if they're an analytics group saying we need cloud training, well, that might mean that they're getting rid of their traditional stack of tools. Maybe they're using Hadoop on-premise in data centers. They're using some old legacy data warehouse appliance. Now they're moving to the cloud. They're embracing cloud analytics. And so maybe that's really their view of the cloud is, how do we do analytics in the cloud? And then the other,
Well, I was going to say, back to the same point I just made, this is another great example of folks who are saying, hey, we're moving to the cloud for analytics. Well, there's new methodologies, new things that are happening in just analytics in general, things like AI and machine learning and those types of things. But we have a ton of customers who are starting off with basic Python training because that's a language used in a lot of analytics groups. But they're also doing not basic, but they're doing data science type classes, statistics, those things, because that's all key to moving analytics to the cloud, so to speak, right? And then when they understand those fundamental concepts, now they can use the cloud provider's tool for analytics. So now they can do analytics in the cloud, but they had to learn the basic statistical methods and those kinds of things before they could work those tools.
Yeah, exactly. And then the last one maybe to mention is this idea they're moving to the cloud, but you still have existing data centers. And so you're in this sort of hybrid architecture. And so you might be running some workloads in your on-prem data centers, others in the public cloud. There are frameworks around that to help in that situation. And one of them is the one you mentioned earlier, OpenShift, right? So that's just one of many of these frameworks that can help. So when somebody says we need cloud training, really it could mean any of these things. And so to look at the cloud training landscape, it's best to kind of say, well, okay, what is a cloud journey? What does it mean to move to the cloud? Because it's very rarely just, hey, we're going to stop running our data centers and let Amazon or Microsoft or Google do that, right? So what I found is that there's sort of three things that happen at once, and they go hand in hand in hand. One is, yes, we're going to start using a public cloud provider, right? But the next is the cloud really helps us embrace DevOps in a deeper way, right? A lot of people have been doing a little bit of DevOps. DevOps is a huge collection of processes, some tools, right? But overall culture change of how you develop and ship software. Yeah.
I was just going to make one comment on DevOps. So for those that have gone through agile training or cultural transformations over the past 20 years or so, and you've heard about those things, DevOps is very similar culturally to agile, right? It's a different way to work as a team. So those two things do go together to help some of the folks that have done agile kind of make some connections.
Yeah, and the last piece I would say is that concept of taking these huge monolithic applications and breaking them up into microservices, right? And so, and then there's technologies around, how best to implement that. So overall, what that really means is that moving to the cloud can mean having to learn all kinds of new skills and various technologies. And so we tried to capture that in a diagram where we sort of, at the center, we've got this public cloud training from whatever your cloud vendor of choice is. But then we've got all these different categories of different kinds of training around it. Whether it's cloud native and container stuff, whether it's those sort of hybrid environments like VMware or OpenShift, all the different kinds of cloud analytics, DevOps, automation, security. And so there's a lot there, and it doesn't all come from one vendor. And to be honest, this diagram could be twice the size. There's so many more logos that we could include. But what we're trying to capture is that, moving to the cloud can touch all these different things, right?
It's amazing how many times we show this diagram to customers and they're just talking about AWS, or they're just talking about Java, or maybe they've got a Snowflake need. And we start looking at this and they go, oh, thank goodness, because that thing over there, we're also doing a lot of that, right? And oftentimes that gives us an opportunity to talk to them and help them explain, like, hey, these things are actually working together, right? Snowflake and Python aren't completely separate, because Snowflake houses a lot of the data, does some of the analytics, but that same team is using other tools like Databricks, but they need to learn Python to be able to do those kinds of things, right? And so a lot of times there's parallels between these things, and it's amazing to see how many of these different tools all of our customers are using.
Yeah. So I thought I would focus a little bit on this cloud native piece, because that's the part where I think learning development folks, it's the really foreign new thing. And so just to get some terminology out of the way, I thought I'm going to run through a couple of slides where, let's talk about cloud native. That is a big buzzword. It is that idea of incorporating these DevOps concepts to get the most out of your public cloud. And so there is a consortium of companies called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and they sort of set the standard for what is cloud native, and they actually house a lot of these open source projects like Kubernetes. And so, the idea is that this collection of techniques should enable loosely coupled systems that are resilient, manageable, observable, right? And they just take the advantages of the cloud fully, right? And so part of that cloud native idea is this concept of microservices. And you may have heard this term before. It's basically a way of building software where instead of deploying one huge deliverable that takes you months and months to build, you deploy it, and then every 6 months you make a change to it. And when the operations people put it into production, there's all these problems we've got to figure out. and instead says, let's blow it up into little pieces, right? These pieces can be independently worked on by different teams. They can be scaled separately. We can iterate on them, right? And so each microservice is independently built, tested, and scaled. And so this kind of fits in nicely with that DevOps idea of, you may have heard that term, two-pizza team. This was coined back in AWS in the early 2000s, where they said, we're going to make these teams that are cross-functional, maybe some developers, some testers, some operations people, but not too many, maybe 8-10 people at the most. Right? You could feed them with two pizzas, and they'll be in charge of this set of microservices from end to end, right? And so how do we implement those microservices? Well, these days, probably the most popular way is with containers, right? Containers is a newer technology. Really, it's been around for a while, but when Docker came out in 2013, it became wildly popular, right? Because this idea of a small reusable piece of code that's very lightweight, I can launch it quickly, I can get rid of it quickly, and I can kind of run it anywhere. I can, as a developer, I could launch this container on my laptop, or later we could deploy it to the cloud or wherever. And it's a great way to encompass one little microservice, right? And, Docker became very popular very quickly for a few of these reasons. Came along at the right time, had a great logo, you can't discount that, right? It became very popular. But the problem was, as the popularity of containers grew, we found that, well, if I am going to break my huge application up into hundreds of these little microservices, and I'm going to run maybe multiple copies of them, now I've got hundreds, maybe thousands of containers to run on some servers. Now I need to figure out how to manage that, how to orchestrate them. And so at Docker, they built something called Swarm. AWS built something called ECS. But the one that really stuck was Kubernetes. This was started at Google, and now it's kind of the de facto standard. And in fact, all the cloud vendors have embraced it. So they all have some kind of a service to help you with it. So if you're going to be running containers and Kubernetes in AWS, you might be using the EKS service. And in fact, if you go to AWS, you start taking some training, you take some basic architecture training, you can then go take a 3-day EKS class. But it sort of assumes that you already know containers and Kubernetes. Where are you going to learn that? Not from AWS, right? That's where all of a sudden we started to realize, hey, we need to supplement that authorized training content that comes from our vendors with various open sources pieces, right? The other big way to implement microservices is through serverless, or what some people call function as a service. And so AWS Lambda, popularized this, but Azure has it, Google Cloud has it. It's just a way of really trying to say, instead of the cloud vendor just taking care of my physical data center, I'm going to let them take care of all my servers as well. So I don't want to think about Linux or Windows administration, right? So it kind of moves, whose responsibility. All of a sudden, my cloud vendor is more responsible for low-level operations, and now my development team becomes much more focused on just development. And so you've got all these different kind of competing concepts. Some of them are complementary, some of them are competing. And so, different organizations pick different ways to do things. And so we end up with a lot of different training offerings. And so this is where really we came up with Cloud-Centrics. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Brian.
Yeah. So again, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, with all these different technologies that we see all of our customers using, it really did get confusing, especially for us too, on where everything fit and what were all the important pieces. And so how do we break it down and put it into a somewhat easy way to digest? And so this particular diagram breaks it into 8 different categories. The public cloud providers at the middle there, but then it also pulls in 7 other areas where there's complementary trainings and technologies where customers need training on those as well. And so, like I was saying earlier, these things all play together. It's not like our example before where you go to Cisco and they give you a top to bottom training plan and it's all Cisco or Microsoft, same thing. Oracle, SAP, it's much different now because it is multi-vendor and there's lots of open source where there is no vendor per se to go to. And so that this is an attempt to kind of summarize the most popular and organize it in a way that's easy to understand.
Yeah, for sure. I think we'll drop the link for this Cloud Centrics a little later in the presentation so people have it. But I guess what our learning and development customers really want to know is, like, how do we go about assessing those cloud training requirements when somebody isn't very forthcoming? They just say, hey, we need cloud training. What do you see, our larger customers doing as far as trying to get that? What is the skills gap?
Well, it's the first thing to remember is it's always it's a conversation. There's never a, well, let's send out a questionnaire and then we'll know, because it's not how it works. And there's a few things at play there. Typically the successful model is either some interviews, some calls, or a survey, and then some conversation back with our technical team, where we kind of refine the questions, ask some additional questions, and then the L&D team goes back and asks those questions. And so it's a little bit of back and forth to really narrow in on what the true requirements are.
Yeah, for sure. And so starting with that idea of a survey, we see most L&D teams will poll their IT leadership periodically, right? Asking for, what are your top 3, top 10, whatever, training requirements. I guess the first thing is, how often are you asking, right? We get some people who ask like once a year, right, when they need to figure out their budgets, right? But what I find is that, cloud moves at a very fast pace, right? And sometimes you start the year saying, okay, we're going to need AWS training or Google Cloud or whatever. And then when you get into it, you realize, oh, we haven't been doing containers and Kubernetes, so we're going to need that too, So it's something that you kind of have to, maybe revisit a little more often, at least do that check back in, right?
Miles, on the first bullet there, I have a customer recently that we've recently engaged in. It's a large publisher, and the learning and development person we're working with there, talking about a training to data analytics learning path, putting that together for them. But we asked, what else are you guys looking at? She said, well, I did a survey and I have a spreadsheet with 84 topics on it, and I do not know what they are, right? And so that was just happened last week, where she was able to share that over with us. But that's a great example for that first bullet. You poll the leadership and you get back a huge list of topics.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the question is, are you just polling the IT management, or is it like kind of a more general survey that you send to all the IT practitioners? We've seen both, right? When you send it to just IT management, what I find is that what you really find is, what are the main priorities, right? They'll each tell you, hey, this is my top 2 priorities. And so it's really good at finding what are the biggest things. But a lot of times what gets lost in the cracks is individual practitioners, what they're struggling with, right? And it might be, hey, this team only has 1 or 2 people, but so does this team and this team and this team, right? And so that's how those major training requirements fall through the cracks. Right? Another thing we find is, are you just asking like a free format question, like, hey, what are your top 3 priorities? Right? That's really good at finding what are the top 3 priorities, unless you get something that's not very actionable, like cloud training, right? We just talked about how that's too broad, right? And so what we have done to success with some of our customers is help them build more of a multiple choice kind of question, where we list out a bunch of technologies, and then you get a lot more focused, hey, these are the specific technologies we need. Now, if you just do that, the problem is, especially if you send it to everybody, right? You've seen that, where everybody just checks everything. They may not even need it for their work. They just want to learn it, And so you got to temper that with, and what are the priorities, right? And I think we've done that pretty effectively in a couple of these surveys that we've helped build, which is, hey, what are the technologies you're struggling with, that you're thinking about using, but also, of all these things you mentioned, what are the top priorities for your team?
And this is, again, you kind of covered it off again here, but I'll point it out. So, one of the we talked about before, one of the challenges with just surveying your management is you get these broad concepts, right? Yeah. But you miss a lot of the smaller requirements. But then when you poll the frontline folks, you get lots of small requirements not all of them pertaining to their job. Some of them very small that they could really learn in an hour on YouTube, honestly.
Yeah.
And so you've got to kind of find that the middle there of what they really need. But the third dynamic to that whole process is, what are the job roles these folks are in? Because you
Yeah.
can't send the same survey to the same job, or the same survey to all different job roles, right? It needs to be tailored and focused. And so in order to do that effectively, you've got to understand where those technologies meet, and what the crossover is and what the crossover isn't, so you can make sure each of those groups gets the correct set of skills that they need.
Yeah, yeah, and like you said, with that publishing company, when they gave us that list of 84 topics, what I found was that it wasn't even close to 84, because there were a lot of like synonyms in there, right? And the learning and development team didn't know that they were synonyms. They didn't know that, you know, these things were pretty much equivalent. And so the real question when you're doing that assessment is, are you having somebody technical review those results, looking for those duplicates or synonyms, and figuring out which of these topics require instructor-led training and which ones are sort of small enough, easy enough, intro enough, that some simple e-learning. And so that's something that's really a big part of what we're doing for some of our largest customers, is being that trusted partner, where somebody says, we had an example, somebody said, hey, I need cucumber training. And they're like, what the heck is cucumber? And so I just told them, you know, kind of basically what it is. I'm like, oh, okay. You know, because there's a lot of weird names, you know, those open source products, you know, they have to come up with a name that doesn't conflict with something else. And so you get a lot of really, really weird stuff. When we're first seeing those learning and development people, just before we even get to a survey, when they start talking to those cloud teams, you know, we thought maybe we would pop up some good questions to ask, right? The first one's the most obvious, right? They say, hey, we want cloud training. We say, well, what public cloud vendor or vendors are we using, right? Because, you know, a lot of people these days are in this multi-vendor environment. They say, okay, well, we want to take intro training. Maybe the cloud team is still investigating which of these clouds do we even want to use, or are we going to also support Azure and Google Cloud, you know? And so, you know, it might be more than one even, but then, you know, are we in that kind of hybrid environment? And if so, are we using any frameworks to manage those workloads across both, right? We see a lot of people who use VMware within their on-prem data centers. And then when they bring in the cloud, they say, hey, we want to use the cloud, but we don't want to learn a whole new way to manage those workloads. So can we not use VMware Cloud on AWS? And the answer is yes, right? It's just a different way of using AWS. Or maybe, like you said, Red Hat OpenShift, right? So there's a lot of these kind of frameworks that we see in hybrid environments. And so, you know, finding out what that is and whether or not that needs training or not, it's a big one. The other one I would say is finding out what kind of workloads are we running? Are we just lifting and shifting existing apps? Well, then you probably just need to learn about the cloud vendor of your choice, right? But are we creating new apps specifically for the cloud? And if so, are we doing them serverless way? Are we doing with containers? Are we using Kubernetes or not? Are people, you know, starting to do microservices? Then we get into, hey, are we further embracing DevOps as part of our cloud journey, right? Do we need some general DevOps training, or do we need specific tools like Git and GitHub, GitLab, Jenkins, you know, CI/CD, pipelines, automation tools like Ansible, Terraform, right? The list goes on and on and on. And we don't expect learning and development people to know all these things, right? And so we can help with those questions. We can help even build that multiple choice survey to try and elicit all this information, right? And then finally, you know, that analytics part, right? Are we using new analytics tools, or are we using the existing ones in the cloud, right? There's things like Snowflake you mentioned where, you know, all of a sudden it's become very, very popular, right? And it's not so easy to find training for it, right? And so this is where I think ExitCertified really can help, you know, fill that role of a trusted provider. Right. And so, you know, our last little bit here is going to be on a little bit of a sales pitch for ExitCertified. What do we do? And a big part of what we do these days, why our biggest customers like us and stay with us is what we're calling our continuous customer care cycle. Right? So maybe Brian, you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So, 5 parts. It is cyclical. So the first piece is obviously gathering requirements. So we talked a lot about that here. How do you, assess who you're going to ask questions? How do you ask those questions? All those kinds of things. We get the right requirements. We get a true understanding of the skills that are most important and how they're important for each job role.
Yeah, so I think step 1 and 2 are sort of, like you said, it's very much a conversation, right? They come to us with some initial requirements, but we're going to have to meet with them to really understand, let's delve deeper. What is that requirement, and chart that effective learning path. And that's really step 3, which is, hey, we're going to build that path. And this is where a company like ExitCertified is great, because we are partnered with 25 plus vendors. So whatever major vendor you're looking at, we generally have that authorized training. And cloud is really our area of expertise. I would say probably AWS is our biggest area, but Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, even Oracle, to a certain degree, those public cloud vendors, we're partnered with them all. And then beyond that, like you mentioned, tools like Databricks or things like that, where we're partnered with those companies to offer their authorized training. But the authorized training doesn't cover everything, right? And that's where we have that multi-vendor where, we go out and we find out who's got the best Kubernetes training, right? Because it's open source. There's no vendor of record. So anybody can hang a sign and say, we do Kubernetes training. So our job is to go and figure out who's got the best of breed training. And then we bring that in. We've got a huge Rolodex of instructors that have built their own specific training on some open source stuff. And you've been dealing with this industry for a long time. You've got far-reaching kind of Rolodex and that side of things, right? So
Yes,
that's a big part. Yeah, sorry, stepped on you there.
I know, years of working with lots of different instructors and lots of different content areas, putting these kinds of programs together.
And like you said, the important part is to look at it and say, hey, it's not just one plan for everybody in an organization, right? We got to look at different job roles. How technical do they need to be? Can we do it with just a 1-hour webinar, right? For the non-technical people, for everyone who's going to bump up against cloud. We've done that a lot where we say, hey, we've got a 1-hour thing, send everybody, your executives, everybody. Then we've got maybe a 1 day, and then we got a 3-day, we do a lot of that kind of, building a specific plan based around all these different job roles. I guess the next step is the actual training, right? we deliver in-person training, self-paced training. We do live virtual classes. We do a lot of virtual classes these days. Our training centers across North America are now open. We're just not finding that many people that are interested in traveling somewhere and taking a class. But it's starting to ramp up a bit. We are sending a lot more instructors into companies to do on-site training. Yeah, sorry.
One thing we are seeing more and more of, and I'd be curious if anybody on the webinar today is seeing it, is longer programs for one to support existing employees in the technology shift, but the second is onboarding programs. There's a huge skills gap in the market, and so we see a lot of our customers coming in and saying, hey, we've got folks coming in with maybe an IT background, maybe not, and we need to put them through this 2, 4, 6, 8 week, 10-week boot camp that's going to get them to the from here to here, and we delivered over 3 months, fewer days per week, that kind of thing. So we've seen a ton of that, and again, it'd be interesting to see if anybody out there is seeing that request.
Yeah, and a lot of those ones we've done end up being a blend of some e-learning and some in-person. Because, there isn't just one learning style for everybody. And so the more touches you get, the more different points of view, the better we find. E-learning is great because it's self-paced, you could do it at your own time, and it's generally very cheap, but, you know, it's only the most highly motivated, self-motivated people that can just go and pile through a bunch of e-learning and become an expert, right? A lot of people, you know, need that person to kind of really break things down for them and to have bounce questions off of them, right? And so we still think that the gold standard is instructor-led training, and ideally in the room with people would be best. Virtual is working pretty well because everybody's really embraced Zoom. But we use whatever remoting technology you need, well, you know, whether it's WebEx or Teams or whatever. We also have this custom training portal that we do for large customers. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the benefits of that portal, Brian.
It has a few different things. It supports registration. It's got some safeguards in there to be sure the people that you want registering are registering, and for the classes you want them to register for. It has some ability to host invoices and rosters and those kinds of things. So it just makes it a little easier to be able to support a large program for you know, hundreds or even thousands of people.
Yeah, and it's good because we get some reporting on the back end too, right? So if you decide to instead of transactionally paying for each class, you know, you can buy what we call a flex, and then you can see how it's being burned down over time. So we get a lot of good reporting out of that too, right?
Yep.
And then after the training, you know, if we're talking about just sort of setting up one training engagement, we typically have this follow-up after, right? Where the sales rep and maybe even the instructor are meeting with whoever, you know, wanted this training and giving them some feedback, talking about the assessments, you know, what did the students think? Here's what we found, you know, what did you find? And really trying to figure out, are there additional training needs? Is there something that's still out there that's not quite addressed yet, right?
Yep. A lot of our customer, sorry, Miles, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So as part of this plan for the future, you know, that as Miles said, that happens the minute class starts. We work with our instructors. Your people spend a lot of time in front of our instructors, and we learn a lot about their skill sets and also your organization and where your organization is going. So it's not uncommon for customers that have larger programs where we deliver the same class over a period of years sometimes, for us to hear from instructors or when we go and talk to the instructors, for them to say, hey, and when I taught the class last year, this was the agenda was a great fit, but since then some things seem to have changed, right? I think we should change, you know, this topic to this topic and maybe add this one and remove this one, getting more interest here. It seems maybe the customers moved on from tools, or there's this tool to that tool. And that's great feedback, because we take that back to our stakeholders at the customer and share it and get their thoughts, right? And oftentimes, you know, they say, hey, yeah, let's make this change. And so we see classes we deliver evolve over the course of, you know, months and of course years. And so that kind of that process, that the importance we place on gathering instructor feedback helps us to keep the classes fresh and current and engaging for the students.
Yeah, great. So obviously this end-to-end customer care that we just mentioned is a big part of why ExitCertified. But I think our real strength is our internal training team. You know, we have a large group for training companies of our size. We have a very large group of in-house instructors that have been with us a long time. They've all been 20 plus years in the industry, you know, we've got some satisfaction ratings on instructor expertise. They've won lots of awards from our various vendors. And, you know, we have this tight group that's been around for a while. They are professional trainers. And then we have sort of the second layer would be, you know, some very trusted contractors, many of whom only work for just us, right? So it's almost just an extension of our instructor team. And so we've got that great instructor team, and then beyond that, you know, we've got that Rolodex of, hey, I need somebody who knows this very specific technology, right? When we have, and there's not that many people that know it, but we can get a hold of them, right? The other thing we do well, I think, is execution with our IMVP. That's what we call our virtual training. We've been doing virtual training since 2012, which that was early days for virtual training, and most people were doing sort of one-way, audio, using WebEx or something like that. And so we embraced the two-way audio video for our classes and really encourage people to turn on their cameras to make it feel like a regular class. We also brought in, in addition to the instructor, there's somebody we call an IMVP producer who's there to make sure everybody's got their materials, everybody's connecting, because what we found was early days of virtual training, you'd lose the first half hour of the instructor's time just trying to troubleshoot problems that the students were having. And so we think that, we've been doing a very great job of it, and the numbers that we gather on customer satisfaction with it, kind of bear that out. And I think during the pandemic, what happened was we just kind of turned it from about 60% virtual to 100% virtual for a while. And so, but we were well situated for that because we'd been doing it for so long. So this is another part of why ExitCertified. I think, we could probably add to this about 10 more things, but the deep vendor partnerships that we have with all of the major players, certainly in cloud and infrastructure, we've got a pretty good list of vendors that we have the authorized training for. And like I said, we've achieved a lot of partner awards and individual instructor awards across all those different vendors. So we're starting to wind down. Maybe talk a little bit about where to go from here. I would think, Brian, you're probably the best person, if somebody doesn't already have a sales rep, maybe reaching out to you with an email is a good start. We also mentioned our Cloud-Centrics portfolio of training. And I think we just put the link in the chat for that. And then, both Brian and my emails are there. And we do have this white paper called Retaining and Upskilling IT Talent 2022 and Beyond. This is sort of for the learning and development crowd. So I thought, well, let's throw that up there too, just if you're looking for it. Anything else to mention, Brian, while we're sort of wrapping up?
I would mention, not just learning and development for that last piece. It's also a lot of our customers that buy for larger groups are project managers or directors or program managers or job roles like that. So it's not exclusively learning and development. But yeah, take a look at that, and we'd love to have a chat. If you just have a couple questions, feel free to email it over, and of course we can jump on the phone if you have more.
Yeah.
We'll open it up for questions.
All right. So. I think we're coming up to time. We wanted to leave some time for questions. I don't know. I don't see any in the Q&A. Maybe we have some in the chat.
We don't have any in the Q&A so far, but I can say kick off one question to kind of get us started, and that would be, kind of what is the first step an L&D leader should take to begin the process of building a cloud training program for their tech team?
Yeah, the first step is usually, engaging with the tech leaders in some way, right? And most L&D is already doing this, but to specifically ask about cloud, I think it starts with saying, what do you mean by cloud training, right? Like, let's delve more into it. And then we have those sort of probing questions that we added so that maybe they could ask high level and figure out what it is before they say, well, maybe we need to, send out some sort of a survey to find out what are the technologies being used. Different organizations, I find, some of them are really top down, where the organization says these are the technologies you must use. Others, it's a little bit more, you have independent teams working on different things. And then when you realize, oh, we've got 5 different teams that are all using the same technology, maybe we need a larger training program. And so I think just starting with that initial discussion with the IT people, and then maybe get in touch with us, to help facilitate that next level where we either interview people or help you build those surveys, right? And that's something we generally do all that free of charge, because, the idea is we want you to figure out exactly what training you need. We don't want to sell you training that you don't need. And we want to make sure that we get exactly what you want so that you keep coming back to us. And so that's why, you know, we want to help as early as possible in that step. And then once we've done that for a customer, you know, once, they tend to come back to us the next year when they say, okay, we're figuring out our training budget for the next year, you know, can you help us again? And so that's that continuous cycle, right? Where we, you know, hopefully we keep coming back and we make you a repeat customer by helping you do your job better. I don't know, Brian, anything else to add to that? I think it's, you know, talk to IT leadership early.
Yeah, it's a good first step. It can go a lot of different ways. So have that initial conversation, and then, you know, that's going to kind of inform you where to go next. And after that, it's, you know, I guess we just have to have more info. So.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions in the chat. I don't know if you guys have any that you receive often from either customers or just people that you're talking to currently, whether that's L&D leaders or people in a similar area that you get often.
I tried to incorporate most of those into the presentation, but maybe there's some others that have come to mind, Miles, since.
No, I think it's a lot of that, like, I got this list of 84 topics. Can you help me make sense of it, right? That's a big part of it. And we got to the point with one of our largest customers where L&D people would just send me emails every week just saying, hey, what is this thing? What is that thing, right? Because they know that I'm able to break that down for them and tell them, here's what the technology is. By the way, that's a 1-hour topic that they can learn, you know, go look at this free online resource, right? And so I think it's that, it's just trying to figure out, is this a big topic or is it a small topic? You know, that sometimes it's hard to figure out when you're non-technical, right? All right. Well, we thank you for your time today. I think we're probably at the end. Hillary, any other questions pop up in the chat?
No, I don't think so far. So thank you so much, Miles and Brian, for doing that for us today. Please keep a lookout for a follow-up email, which should be sent to you by the end of the week, which should be having the recording for this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.